There was more than 2 pounds of diamonds sewn into their undergarments. That's what the executioners discovered when the bullets bounced off. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, in the basement of a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, Western Siberia, 4 young women who had grown up in the most sumptuous palaces in the world, who had slept on hand-embroidered sheets, who had posed for the most prominent photographers in Europe, who had been presented to kings and presidents as the grand duchesses of the wealthiest family in modern history, found themselves standing before a firing squad in a windowless room with lime-stained walls. Sewn into the lining of their corsets, with thread and patience over weeks of captivity, were the diamonds their mother had taken from the imperial coffers, in the hope that they might serve as ransom currency or as a lifeline in the exile she still believed possible. The diamonds didn't save them. They made the process longer and more brutal than Commander Yakov Yurovsky had planned. The bullets bounced off. The executioners had to resort to bayonets, to rifle butts, to point-blank shots to the head. That is what it cost the Bolshevik regime to liquidate the last living asset of the greatest imperial fortune the world had ever known. This is the story of Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov, the 4 daughters of Russia's last Tsar, the 4 young women whom history has treated for more than a century as the photogenic backdrop of a drama that was supposedly about their parents and their sick brother. The 4 women whose voices, whose diaries, whose letters, and whose completely distinct personalities have been buried under the weight of imperial nostalgia, the romanticization of the Russian Camelot, and the perpetual fascination with the mystery of Anastasia. They were 23, 21, 19, and 16 years old when they died. To understand what happened to the Romanov sisters, you first have to understand the world they were born into, and that world began with a number. At the height of his power, the personal fortune of Nicholas II, Russia's last Tsar, has been estimated by various sources at figures ranging from $250 billion to $300 billion in today's value. The ranking of the wealthiest individuals in modern history, compiled periodically by various financial analysts, places Nicholas II in 4th place of all time, behind only Mansa Musa of Mali, John D. Rockefeller, and Carnegie in the early years of the Steel Trust. That figure requires a clarification that Russian historians themselves are the first to make. The vast majority of that wealth was not, in strictly modern terms, the Tsar's personal property. It was Russian state property administered by the crown. The palaces, the art collections, the imperial yachts, the millions of acres of agricultural land that generated revenues feeding the imperial treasury did not belong to Nicholas II, the way Bill Paley personally owned his apartment at the St. Regis, or the way Joe Kennedy personally owned the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. They belonged to the institution of which he was the head, and when the institution fell, they went with it. But the Tsar's personal wealth, the portion he controlled independent of state assets, was also extraordinary. In 1896, the year after his coronation, his personal funds totaled 2 million rubles and 355,000 francs. His annual income from the treasury was 24 million rubles in gold. The imperial jewels, not the official state regalia, but the family's personal pieces, constituted one of the most valuable collections in the world. Diamonds of hundreds of carats, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies accumulated over 3 centuries of Romanov dominion over the largest nation on earth by territorial extent. And then there were the Fabergé eggs. Between 1885 and 1916, the house of jeweler Carl Fabergé produced 50 imperial eggs on direct commission from the family. Each was a work of goldsmithing that no catalogue price could pin down, precisely because none had an equivalent on the market. The first, commissioned by Alexandra III for his wife in 1885, contained inside it a golden hen that in turn held a miniature replica of the imperial crown and a ruby pendant. Those that followed grew more elaborate, more costly, and more extraordinary with each passing year. The Fabergé eggs were the most visible indicator of the luxury spending levels of an imperial family that understood luxury as part of the political language of power. The Romanov fortune was not merely an accumulation of palaces and art collections. It was a complete economic system that included agricultural land on an industrial scale, gold and platinum mines in the Urals, textile factories, timber assets, and nominal control over the natural resources of the world's largest nation. The revenues from crown lands, generating annual income that economists of the era estimated in the tens of millions of rubles, were only one part of the financial flow sustaining the imperial apparatus. Every adult member of the Romanov family received an annual allowance from the imperial treasury, fixed by law since 1884, at 100,000 rubles for the heir and lesser amounts for the remaining Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses. For a sense of scale, the annual salary of an industrial worker in early 20th century Russia was between 120 and 200 rubles. The heir's annual allowance was equivalent to 500 times that salary. The imperial yacht standard, built in 1895, measured 403 feet in length and was described by everyone who visited it as a floating palace. It had mahogany-panelled salons, crystal chandeliers, an Orthodox chapel on board, and staterooms that reproduced the opulence of Alexandra Palace at the reduced scale the sea imposes. The Tsar family spent weeks on it each summer, sailing through the Finnish fjords. For the sisters, those summer cruises were the moments of greatest freedom they ever knew, far from court, far from the strictest protocol, in a space where they could swim, row, play with the sailors, and behave like something resembling normal people within the limits that permanent security imposed. The Fabergé eggs the Tsar, commissioned each year for his mother and his wife, cost between 4,000 and 40,000 rubles each, depending on the complexity of the piece. The most elaborate of all, the Great Coronation Egg of 1897, depicted the 18th century gold carriage that had transported Alexandra to her coronation, reproduced at 1/10 scale with a precision that caused Fabergé himself to spend 15 months completing it. In 2002, one of the 50 imperial eggs was auctioned at Christie's London for $9.6 million. The collection of those still in private hands is valued, today, in the hundreds of millions. It was in that world, among palaces and yachts and jewels, and a court that revolved around their father as the universe revolves around the sun, that Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov grew up. But the world the four sisters actually lived in, the daily world behind the official photographs and the white lace portraits, was considerably more austere than any description of the imperial fortune suggests. Nicholas II and Alexandra Feodorovna, the German-born Tsarina, born Princess of Hesse and favourite granddaughter of England's Queen Victoria, raised their children with a Spartan discipline that baffled most observers at court who were aware of the level of wealth available. The sisters shared bedrooms in pairs, Olga and Tatiana together, called the big pair, and Maria and Anastasia together, called the little pair. They slept on military cots, not canopied beds. They took cold showers in the mornings. They received modest gifts, a single pearl on birthdays, and their favourite perfumes. Their clothes were made by French designers, and their shoes came from London. But in daily life, they lived with a simplicity that their aristocratic Russian peers found difficult to comprehend. Alexandra suffered from fragile health that her biographers describe as a combination of genuine physical ailments, including heart problems and chronic sciatica, and a tendency toward isolation and melancholy that kept her away from the court and from the Russian society that should have been her natural environment. The German empress was never loved by the Russian people, who found her cold, distant, and too heavily influenced by her almost mystical faith. Comparisons to her popular mother-in-law, Maria Feodorovna, widow of Tsar Alexander III, and Nicholas's mother, were constant and always unfavourable to Alexandra. The four daughters grew up as caretakers. That is the fact that historian Helen Rappaport, author of Four Sisters, the most comprehensive book on the Romanov sisters, published in 2014, identified as the true axis of their biographies once she gained access to the diaries and correspondence that had remained unpublished or untranslated for decades in Russian state archives. The sisters cared for their mother during her episodes of prostration. They cared for their brother Alexei during his bleeding crises. They cared for the Tsar against the loneliness of absolute power, being his most honest and most cheerful companions. Their voices in those diaries, Rappaport writes, are full of hope, love, and an optimism that persists in spite of everything. But before talking about the sisters, we need to talk about the illness that shaped everything else. Because without Alexei, without Alexei's hemophilia, without the panic that hemophilia generated in his mother, and without the figure who exploited that panic to install himself at the nucleus of imperial power, the story of the Romanov sisters would have been entirely different, and might have ended another way. Alexei Nikolaevich, Nicholas and Alexandra's only son, heir to the most extensive empire on the planet, was born on August 12, 1904, with hemophilia B, the severe form of the disease that prevents proper blood clotting. He had inherited the genetic mutation from his mother Alexandra, who had inherited it from her grandmother, Queen Victoria of England, who appears to have been the original carrier of that specific mutation in the Saxe-Coburg line. Alexei's hemophilia was the severe form of the disease. Any bump, any fall, any minor physical trauma could trigger internal bleeding that lasted for days, that caused pain the doctors of the era had no effective way to alleviate, and that on several occasions brought the boy to the edge of death. Alexandra lived with that fear as the permanent backdrop of every day of her life, and into that fear found his point of entry Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, the Siberian peasant who had arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903 with a reputation as a mystic healer, and who by 1905 had been introduced to the imperial family as someone who might help the boy where conventional medicine had failed. What happened next is one of the most debated episodes in modern Russian history. Rasputin appears to have had some real effect on Alexei's bleeding crises, an effect historians today explain in terms of hypnosis, producing a state of relaxation that reduced blood pressure and slowed the bleeding, or of a placebo effect on Alexandra's anguish that in turn calmed the boy. Whatever the mechanism, the result was that Alexandra considered him literally a messenger from God and granted him access to the court that soon became real and growing political influence. For the Romanov sisters, Rasputin was an ambivalent presence. He appears in their diaries and correspondence in ways historians have analyzed carefully. Some of the sisters, especially Olga, the eldest, expressed in private a certain discomfort with their mother's level of dependence on the monk. But all of them understood that Rasputin was, for Alexandra, inseparable from Alexei's well-being, and that questioning Rasputin was questioning that. What Rasputin's presence did to the family's public image is clearer and better documented. The Tsar's enemies, the nobility seeking to weaken the crown, the reformists who wanted to limit imperial power, the journalists covering St. Petersburg's excesses, all found in the figure of the Siberian peasant who supposedly controlled the empress a perfect propaganda weapon. Pamphlets were published with caricatures depicting Rasputin in compromising positions with Alexandra and her daughters. The accusations were false, but they circulated with the speed and effectiveness that lies achieve when enough people want to believe them. The Romanov sisters' names were tainted by association before they were old enough to fully understand what was happening. That is one of the layers of this story that the subsequent romanticization of the Russian Camelot tends to smooth over. That Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia grew up as the subjects of explicit sexual rumors circulating in the press and in the salons of St. Petersburg, rumors that were entirely fabricated, and that their parents, unable to control the reputational damage or simply refusing to acknowledge its severity, did nothing effective to protect them from it. Olga Nikolaevna, the eldest, was born on November 15, 1895, at Tsarskoye Selo. She was, according to everyone who knew her and according to her own correspondence, the most similar in character to the Tsar. Intelligent, somewhat melancholy, a voracious reader with a tendency toward introversion. Historian Rappaport describes Olga as the most independent of the four and the one who most clearly saw the contradictions of the world she lived in. Blonde, with blue eyes, physically less striking than Tatiana, but with an intelligence that the tutors who worked with the family consistently described as exceptional. Olga was the first of the sisters to reach marriageable age, which in the context of early 20th century European royal families meant becoming prime diplomatic currency. The Romanovs were the richest and most influential family in Europe, and marrying a Grand Duchess to the right heir could cement alliances, consolidate borders, and move financial resources on a scale no trade treaty could match. Multiple candidates were speculated about. The name of her cousin, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia, circulated as a possible suitor before the war, and the events of 1916 cancelled any such conversation. When war broke out in 1914, Olga was 18. Marriage negotiations halted and never resumed. Tatiana Nikolaevna, the second, was born on June 10, 1897. She was physically the most striking of the four, tall, slender, with dark brown hair and nearly grey eyes that the Yvzhiye, photographers of the era, captured in hundreds of portraits. Everyone who knew her agreed in describing her as the family's classic beauty and the one most similar in character to her mother. Tatiana had the sense of order, the determination, and the organizational drive that Alexandra possessed, but without the anxiety that accompanied those traits in the Empress. Her sisters called her the Governess, a nickname that was half joke and half acknowledgement of her genuine leadership capacity within the group. Tatiana was her mother's favorite, the one who spent the most hours with Alexandra reading aloud to her, the one who served as bridge between the reclusive Empress and the rest of the world. When Nicholas took personal command of the army at the front in 1915, and Alexandra became the primary interlocutor for the government in the capital, it was Tatiana who most directly felt the pressure that role was placing on her mother, and who most clearly recognized that something was tilting dangerously off balance in the family's political equation. Maria Nikolaevna, the third, was born on June 26, 1899. She was the most physical of the four, strong, athletic, with an expansive energy that contrasted with the more contained intensity of her two older sisters. Her blue eyes were so striking that the family called them Maria's eyes. She was the most sociable of all the sisters, the one who connected most easily with people outside the family's immediate circle, including the soldiers the sisters came into contact with during their work as nurses in the wartime hospitals. There are letters from Russian soldiers that speak of Maria with a warmth and familiarity that goes well beyond the protocol any Grand Duchess should have inspired in the military ranks. She allowed it, and she sought it out. She needed contact with the outside world in a way her sisters didn't need with the same urgency. One of the darkest details in Maria's individual biography, verified by various biographers, though with the nuances that the ambiguity of sources requires, is her relationship with Lord Louis Mountbatten, the maternal nephew of Prince Philip of Edinburgh, and a central figure in 20th century British naval history. Mountbatten was a second cousin of the Romanov sisters through the Hesse branch, and in his childhood had direct contact with the Russian imperial family. He left it in writing, with a candour that surprises even in his private memoirs, that he was crazy about her and determined to marry her, that he could not imagine anyone more beautiful. Mountbatten kept a photograph of Maria, taken in 1914, on the nightstand of his bedroom until the day of his own violent death in 1979, when the IRA blew up his boat in Ireland. Anastasia Nikolaevna, the youngest, was born on June 18, 1901, at Peterhof Palace. Her arrival was, according to the direct testimony of several members of the court, received with barely concealed disappointment. 4 daughters. Still no male heir. The pressure on Alexandra to produce a son was growing, and the arrival of a 4th girl increased the perception, already circulating in the superstitious circles of Russian society, that some curse hung over the Romanovs, preventing the continuation of the male line. The disappointment surrounding her birth left no visible mark on Anastasia. She was, according to everyone who knew her, and according to her own correspondence, the most mischievous, the most joyful, and the most subversive of the 4. Historian Rappaport writes that Anastasia had a special ability to lighten the emotional weight of any situation, including the most difficult ones, with a humour that sometimes bordered on recklessness, but was completely genuine. She was also a notably skilled amateur photographer for her age, with dozens of snapshots taken with her own camera that form part of the family photo archive preserved in Russian state archives, and that show, better than any official portrait, the informal and human side of the sisters. The famous anecdote of Anastasia sticking her tongue out at Commander Yurovsky when he turned his back on her in the Apatiev house in the final days of captivity says more about her character than any formal biographical description. 2 days before being executed, The youngest of the Romanov sisters still found room for that kind of small, completely useless, but absolutely necessary act of resistance, to maintain some form of inner dignity. The war changed everything. When Germany declared war on Russia in August 1914, and Russia entered the conflict that would destroy 4 empires in 4 years, the 2 oldest sisters, Olga and Tatiana, were 18 and 16 years old. They trained as Red Cross nurses alongside their mother, not as support staff or as decorative figures at charity events, but as real nurses who worked in the hospitals of the Tsarskoye Selo territory, treating wounded soldiers arriving from the Western Front. The photographs of Olga and Tatiana in nurses' uniforms, no jewelry, hair pinned back under the white coif, performing wound care and assisting in surgeries, are among the most striking in the Romanov archive, precisely because they contrast so radically with the imperial portraits of lace and pearls. Maria and Anastasia were too young for direct nursing work, but they regularly visited the hospitals, talked with the soldiers, wrote them letters, and brought them gifts. Maria, in particular, developed a relationship with the hospitalized patients that contemporary testimonies describe as genuinely close. It wasn't the condescending charity of an aristocrat visiting the poor. It was real contact between people sharing a space and a time of crisis. It was during the war that Nicholas committed the mistake his own advisors had warned him not to commit. In September 1915, he took personal command of the Russian army at the front, leaving the management of government affairs in St. Petersburg in Alexandra's hands. What looked like a gesture of patriotic resolve was in practice a political catastrophe. Alexandra had no preparation for the function she was being assigned, and Rasputin, who remained her primary advisor, had no preparation for becoming the de facto power behind the throne, which is what he effectively began to be from that moment on. The dispatches between Alexandra and Nicholas, that historians have analyzed for decades, show an empress transmitting to the front Rasputin's advice on ministerial appointments, domestic policy decisions, and military strategy, with the same blind faith with which she transmitted his advice on Alexei's health. The decisions made at a distance on Rasputin's foundations contributed to accelerating the discrediting of the imperial government at a moment when Russia was accumulating military defeats, food shortages, and social unrest that the Tsar's intelligence services could see growing without being able to stop it. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats that included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia, the Tsar's cousin, and Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in the empire, invited Rasputin to the Yusupov palace with the intention of killing him. Rasputin's death is one of the most mythologized episodes in Russian history. According to the best-known versions, which contemporary historians have nuanced but not refuted in their essential aspects, Rasputin survived the poison placed in the pastries and wine, survived the first gunshot, and had to be finally killed with several additional shots before his killers threw him into the Malaya Nevka Canal beneath the ice. Whatever the exact sequence of events, the result was that the man who had been the axis of influence over Alexandra, the man whose name had damaged the Romanov sisters' reputations for a decade, died that night in December 1916. Before dying, Rasputin had written Nicholas a letter that biographers repeatedly cite because its prophetic accuracy is unsettling. If men of the government killed him, the entire imperial family would be destroyed. If peasants killed him, the throne would survive. Those who killed him were aristocrats. What came afterward confirmed point by point what the letter had announced. In February 1917, with the Russian army demoralized and the Eastern Front collapsing, with food shortages producing riots in the streets of St. Petersburg, with industry paralyzed and the railways in disarray, the unrest reached the point of no return. Troops called in to suppress the protests refused to fire, and in many cases joined the demonstrators. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated in favor of his brother Grand Duke Michael, who refused the throne. Within 48 hours, the Romanov family had ceased to be Russia's imperial family. 304 years of dynastic rule ended in a railway car in Pskov. For the sisters, the abdication occurred at a particularly cruel moment. All of them were sick with measles, a disease they had caught from the cadets visiting the palace, which in some cases reached complications that kept them bedridden for weeks. Olga and Anastasia developed severe ear infections. Alexei also fell ill. The family was literally incapacitated at Tsarskoye Selo Palace when the world around them was collapsing, receiving news of the abdication filtered through the loyalists who still remained with them. The provisional government that succeeded the Tsar ordered the family's arrest at Alexandra Palace. The Romanovs went from being the most powerful and wealthy family in the world to prisoners in their own home within a matter of weeks. The inventory of what they could keep and what was confiscated, the limits placed on their movement within the palace, the reduction of household staff from hundreds to dozens, the gradual transformation of living conditions from majestic to merely comfortable, all of that was the beginning of a process that would end 18 months later in the basement of Yekaterinburg. In August 1917, the provisional government transferred the family to Tobolsk in Siberia on the grounds of removing them from the political agitation in the capital. In Tobolsk, conditions began to deteriorate more visibly. Rations were reduced. Staff was reduced further. Communication with the outside world was restricted. The sisters continued their routines with a discipline that their own diaries, written until the very end, document as their primary tool of psychological survival. Language lessons, reading aloud, needlework, board games, the theatrical performances they organized among themselves to keep their spirits up. It was during the Tobolsk period that Tatiana made a decision that Commander Yurovsky would discover months later in the basement of Yekaterinburg. Using the money and jewels that Alexandra had managed to take from Alexandra Palace before the transfer, conveniently hidden from the revolutionaries inside clothing and in the lining of suitcases, the sisters began sewing diamonds into their corsets, into the inside of their blouses, into the seams of their skirts. The idea was to preserve whatever capital they had left for the moment when they might be able to leave Russia or negotiate their freedom. The Tsarina had compiled during her captivity in Tobolsk a handwritten list of her jewels, a document that historians interpret as evidence that there was at least a contingency plan for using that capital in exile. That plan was never executed. In April 1918, as the anti-communist White Army advanced from the east and the Bolsheviks began to fear that the Romanovs might be liberated, or that the Germans, who had already signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the new regime, might claim the family as the Kaiser's relatives by marriage, Lenin ordered the prisoners transferred to Yekaterinburg. Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria were the first to depart. Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Alexei, who had suffered another severe hemophilia crisis that made him untransportable, remained in Tobolsk for several more weeks until the boy's condition improved enough to move him. The weeks of separation are one of the darkest episodes of the final period. The three older sisters caring for their brother in Tobolsk without knowing exactly where their parents were or what conditions they would find when they arrived in Yekaterinburg. Tatiana organizing the household, distributing tasks, maintaining the discipline the family needed to function. Olga writing in her diary. Anastasia taking photos with her camera until the guards confiscated it. When they finally arrived in Yekaterinburg in May 1918 and were reunited with their parents and Maria in the Ipatiev house, what they found was worse than anything they had known before. The Ipatiev house had been designated by the Bolsheviks as the house of special purpose. The Isikia windows had been painted white so they could neither see out nor be seen from the street. A double-height wooden fence had been built around the perimeter, blocking any visual contact with the outside world. There were 300 guards. Rations were military-grade, without butter or coffee. The only outdoor time permitted was a brief walk in an enclosed garden. In May, a sentry fired at Anastasia when she leaned her head out the window of the bedroom she shared with her three sisters. Conditions deteriorated progressively as the summer of 1918 advanced. The White Army was closing in on Yekaterinburg from the east. The Bolsheviks were receiving reports that anti-communist forces were attempting to organize the family's rescue. The Ural Regional Soviet, the local body overseeing the imprisonment, requested instructions from Moscow. The instructions arrived in the form of authorization to execute everyone. In the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, Commander Yurovsky entered the family's rooms after midnight and informed them that they needed to get up, get dressed, and come down to the basement. He told them there had been counter-revolutionary activity in the city, and that for security reasons they needed to be temporarily relocated, The family obeyed. Nicholas carried Alexei in his arms because the boy had an injured leg. Alexandra asked that chairs be brought down to the basement for herself and the boy. The sisters dressed in the clothing that had the diamonds sewn into it. They settled into the small basement room as if they were about to wait. The Tsar's personal physician, Dr. Botkin, was with them. The lady's maid, Anna Demidova, the cook, Karitonov, the assistant Trupp. 11 people in a room of roughly 200 square feet. Yurovsky entered with a group of armed men, produced a sheet of paper, and read the resolution of the Ural Regional Soviet condemning Nicholas Romanov to death for crimes against the people. Nicholas turned toward his family, and barely had time to say what. The shooting began. What happened in the next 20 minutes was documented by Yurovsky himself in a report that remained classified for decades and was declassified in the 1990s. The room was small. The powder smoke filled the space rapidly. Visibility was nearly zero. Nicholas and Alexandra died in the first shots. Dr. Botkin and the servants died in the first minutes. But the sisters did not. The diamonds sewn into their corsets and into the inside of their clothing acted as improvised bulletproof vests. The bullets bounced off or were stopped by the layers of fabric and gemstones. Yurovsky writes that it was a chaotic slaughter. The executioners had to change tactics. They resorted to bayonets, which also failed to penetrate effectively. They resorted to rifle butts. They fired point-blank into the heads. Tatiana died of a shot to the back of the skull. It was among the quickest of her sisters. Olga also died of a gunshot to the head. Maria and Anastasia were the last. Anastasia screamed and covered her face with her arm when the executioners approached. She was stabbed in the chest with a bayonet and then received the final shot to the head. They were 23, 21, 19, and 16 years old. The bodies were carried out on stretchers, taken to the Koptyaki forest, stripped, mutilated with sulfuric acid to prevent identification, and buried in a pit that the executioners attempted to deepen by blowing it open with grenades. The grenades didn't work properly. The pit was left too shallow. Years later, as the Soviet Union began to crumble, historian Alexander Avdonin located the remains in 1991 using metal detectors and probe rods. DNA analyses performed by multiple international laboratories, including the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory of the United States and the University of Innsbruck in Austria, confirmed the identities. The remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, and one of the two younger sisters were found in the primary pit. The remains of Alexei and the other sister, whose specific identification continues to be debated between Russian and American experts, were found in 2007 in a second pit 70 meters from the first. On July 17, 1998, exactly 80 years after the execution, the identified remains were buried with full state honors in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, where most Russian emperors have rested since Peter the Great. President Boris Yeltsin attended the ceremony. Prince Michael of Kent represented Queen Elizabeth II, who was the sister's third cousin. The remains of Alexei and the second sister, whose authenticity the Russian Orthodox Church has questioned for years, with arguments that the scientists who conducted the DNA tests consider groundless, remain in Russian state archives, pending a decision on their final burial that has still not been made. The Anastasia myth is the final chapter of the Romanov sisters' story that deserves to be treated with the precision it merits. For decades, the ambiguity over which two remains were missing from the 1991 pit fed the popular belief that Anastasia, the youngest of the sisters, might have survived the execution. That belief was exploited by dozens of impostors throughout the 20th century, the most famous of whom was Anna Anderson, whose case was the center of legal proceedings in Germany for decades. Anna Anderson died in the United States in 1984, claiming until the very end to be Grand Duchess Anastasia. In 1994, scientists performed DNA tests, comparing her hair with the DNA of living members of the Romanov family. The result was conclusive. Anna Anderson was a Polish woman named Franziska Szankowska, who had disappeared from Poland years before Anderson emerged in Germany. She had no relation to the Romanovs whatsoever. Her primary motivation, according to the investigators who analyzed the case, was to access the Romanov fortune, which in the early years of the extended Romanov family's exile, some surviving members claimed might still exist in Swiss bank accounts. Only a legitimate heir could claim those funds. Franziska Shanskowska wanted to be that heir. The funds, supposedly existing in Swiss accounts, are another of the myths surrounding the Romanov fortune. The documented reality is more complex and more tragic. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, the Tsar's brother-in-law, stated in his memoirs that a personal family fortune supposedly transferred to England during the reign of Alexander II had been spent entirely on financing hospitals and charitable organizations during the war years. That the minister of the imperial court, acting against the Tsar's orders, had in 1914 transferred the annual allowance funds for the Tsar's 5 children to Berlin, 7 million rubles in total, which the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s reduced to ashes. That what remained of Nicholas II's personal fortune at the time of abdication was nationalized by the provisional government and then looted by the Bolsheviks. The jewels the Romanovs managed to take with them, some of which were discovered sewn into the sisters' clothing in Yekaterinburg, some of which left Russia by other means, ended up scattered across the world in ways that antique dealers and auction houses are still tracing more than a century later. The necklace of Empress Catherine the Great, made of 389 natural pearls, reached Cartier and was sold to American automobile magnate Horace Dodge. In 2018, 3 strands of that necklace, assembled with a diamond Cartier clasp, were auctioned in New York for $1.1 million. The sapphire set of Empress Maria Feodorovna, Nicholas's mother, with its largest sapphire weighing more than 200 carats, also reached Cartier, which in 2015 turned it into a bracelet called the Romanov bracelet. The diamonds of the Russian imperial crown, those that could not be taken out of the country, are today in the Diamond Fund of Russia, where they are the most costly pieces in the Russian state collection. The Russian Revolution that destroyed the Romanovs was also the first major forced redistribution of private capital of the 20th century. The assets the family had accumulated over 300 years, from real estate to art collections, to jewels to stakes in strategic industries, were nationalized, looted, sold, or simply destroyed in the chaos that followed October 1917. The Bolsheviks needed foreign currency to finance the new state, and one of their first strategies was selling art and jewels from the old regime on international markets. European auction houses bought Romanov pieces at prices that the original owners, had they been able to weigh in, would have considered an insult. Some of the jewels ended up in private collections in America and Europe that to this day include pieces of Russian imperial origin, without their current owners always knowing or wanting to know the precise details of how they got there. The Diamond Fund of Russia, created by the Soviets to preserve the most important pieces, contains today what remains of the official collection. The imperial crown with its nearly 5,000 diamonds, the imperial scepter with the 189.62 carat Orlov diamond set in its tip, the Fabergé eggs that the Soviet state kept before selling the rest. These are the assets of the old regime that the Soviet Union decided were worth more preserving as symbols of state power than liquidating for foreign currency. Everything else was dispersed, much was lost. Some continues to circulate on the antiques market under descriptions that avoid mentioning the origin. The darkest paradox of the Romanov fortune is that the diamonds sewn into the sisters' corsets, which had kept them alive for 20 additional minutes in the Yekaterinburg basement, were confiscated by the executioners, along with the rest of the clothing, before the bodies were transported to the forest. Yurovsky's records document the confiscation. What happened afterward with those specific stones has never been established with certainty. Some biographers suggest that some of those jewels entered the black market of the 1920s. Others, that they were handed over to the Soviet treasury. The story of those specific diamonds, the last assets of the personal estates of the 4 Grand Duchesses, is one of the many accounts the 20th century left unsettled. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, while the firing squad waited for final orders, the 4 sisters were in the room they shared on the upper floor of the Ipatiev house. They didn't know for certain what was going to happen that night, but they had been living for weeks under conditions that had deteriorated at an accelerating pace. They had arrived in Yekaterinburg in May with the clothes on their backs and whatever they had managed to pack during the transfer from Tobolsk. Since then, contact with the outside world had been virtually non-existent. Letters took weeks or never arrived. Newspapers were prohibited. The daily walk in the garden was the only breath of fresh air. The Guards had been replaced in July by a harder contingent, less susceptible to the humanizing influence Maria had achieved with the previous group. Yurovsky, the new commander appointed in July 1918, was a man of bureaucratic efficiency that his subsequent reports convey with chilling clarity. He had received his instructions from Moscow. He had planned the operation. He had assigned each member of the firing squad their specific target to minimize chaos. The plan was to kill each person with a single shot. As he himself documented afterward, the plan didn't work. What did work was the subsequent cover-up. The bodies were transferred to the forest in the dark. They were stripped, mutilated with sulfuric acid, and buried. The Bolshevik regime announced the death of the Tsar, but maintained silence about the rest of the family for years. That informational opacity, maintained as state policy for decades and turned into prohibition under Stalin, was one of the most successful acts of censorship in the 20th century. It managed to suppress the truth about the deaths of 4 young women for 73 years. The canonization of the Romanov family as passion-bearers by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2000 added yet another layer to a story that already had too many. Nicholas and Alexandra were recognized as holy passion-bearers, a specific category in the Orthodox tradition applied to those who died with Christian patience without having actively provoked their own death. The sisters were canonized alongside them. Today, there are icons of Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia in thousands of Orthodox churches across Russia and the Russian diaspora worldwide. The 4 young women who stuck their tongues out at guards in captivity and wrote jokes in their diaries and complained about the boredom of Tobolsk are now objects of religious veneration in a faith they would have recognized, but in a form that would surely have struck them as strange. The months of captivity in Tobolsk and then in Yekaterinburg transformed the sisters in ways their diaries document with an honesty that is impossible to read without the weight of knowing what is coming. Olga, always the most melancholy of the 4, developed a depression that her fellow captives recorded with growing concern. Tatiana maintained her sense of order and discipline, but the letters from those months show cracks of doubt not present in her earlier writing. Maria sought and found connection with the guards, keeping watch over the house, with results that generated both hope and problems. Some guards developed sympathy for the family and passed messages to the outside, which gave rise to an attempt to organize a rescue that never materialized. Anastasia wrote in her diary, with the same humor as always, but there are entries from the final period in the Ipatiev house that her biographers read as signs that even she had begun to understand the situation was different from anything before. The rescue attempts were real, but never came in time. A group of monarchist officers, known in the historical archives as the Kobelinsky Group, maintained encrypted correspondence with the family during the Tobolsk period. Some messages arrived, hidden inside the stoppers of cream jars, others inside books. The family responded in the same code. Rescue plans were drawn up and discarded multiple times. The transfer to Yekaterinburg, decided and executed before any of those plans could be activated, left everyone without a way out. The White Army reached Yekaterinburg 24 days after the execution. The Bolshevik regime's initial silence about the family's fate contributed for decades to feeding the hope that someone had survived. The Soviets announced the Tsar's death, but claimed the family had been transferred to a safe location. That deliberate ambiguity, maintained for years for political reasons, was the breeding ground where imposters, legends, and the Anastasia myth took root. It wasn't until 1938, under Stalin, that all public discussion of the subject was prohibited. And it wasn't until 1991, as the Soviet Union was disintegrating, that the remains found by Avdonin could be investigated without political obstruction. The story of the Romanov sisters has generated, in the century since their death, a mythology that renews itself with every generation. The 1997 animated film produced a romanticized version presenting Anastasia as a fairy tale heroine with a happy ending. The Broadway musical that opened in 2017 brought that version to the stage in full evening wear and song. Netflix's docudrama series, The Last Tsars, released in 2019, attempted a balance between dramatization and historical documentation with mixed results. Each new generation finds a different mirror in the Romanov sisters. What honest history finds, if it does the work of reading the diaries and letters rather than the romanticized versions, is something more specific and more unsettling than any fairy tale. It finds 4 young women who were raised to be the finest dynastic assets of the wealthiest family in the world, who never had real access to the decisions that affected their own lives, who spent their adolescence and early adulthood caring for a sick mother and a brother with an incurable disease, and a father who couldn't or wouldn't understand what was coming for him until it was too late, and who at the end of that process found themselves in a basement with more than 2 pounds of diamonds sewn into their clothing and 12 men with guns. The cultural impact of the Romanov sisters' story in the century, since their death, surpasses any comparable episode in 20th century history. There is something in the combination of extreme wealth, youth, photographically documented beauty, violent death, and persistent mystery about the identity of the remains that activates a kind of fascination that never exhausts itself. Every new generation produces its own version. The 1997 animated film, the 2017 Broadway musical, the documentary series, the popular history books, the role-playing games set in the Tsarist court, the fan fiction, the enthusiast groups that maintain websites with the family album photographs in high resolution. The image of the 4 in their white lace dresses is one of the most reproduced and recognized images in the entire photographic history of the 20th century. But that image, beautiful as it is also a trap. It is exactly the image that the Tsarist propaganda apparatus produced for public consumption. The Tsar's 4 daughters, as the family backdrop of the most powerful monarchy in the Olifau world, the perfect girls of the perfect family, of the perfect empire. The reality behind that image, the reality that the diaries, the letters, and the testimonies of those who knew them reveal, is far more specific and far more human. 4 distinct people with distinct characters, distinct hopes, and distinct ways of facing the situation in which the accident of birth and their parents' decisions had placed them. 4 voices, Rappaport writes, full of hope, love, and optimism. Voices that the noise of official archives and subsequent romanticization has muffled for more than a century. There is a detail in the individual biographies of the sisters that specialists in the period document, and that popular versions tend to overlook. All 4 had their own plans, hopes, and desires that went well beyond being the Tsar's daughters. Olga had expressed in her private correspondence the desire to marry someone who truly loved her, regardless of dynastic calculations. She had reportedly declined, according to some biographers, though sources are not unanimous on this point, a marriage proposal from Prince Carol of Romania because she felt nothing for him. Tatiana had developed, during her years of nursing work, a genuine medical competence that the hospital doctors described with respect in their memoirs. Maria had spoken aloud, in letters to her friends, of wanting to have children. Anastasia, the youngest, had written that she wanted to learn to fly. None of those things ever came to pass. The oldest of the sisters was 23 when she died. The war and the captivity and the revolution had consumed exactly the years in which those individual lives would have begun to take on their own shape. The diamonds they wore, sewn into their clothing, were not only an emergency financial asset. They were the last symbol of everything the system to which they belonged had taught them about value and power. Wealth as protection, capital as security, the fortune accumulated across generations as a guarantee that nothing truly terrible could happen as long as that capital existed. That logic worked for 304 years of the Romanov dynasty. It did not work in the basement of the Ipatiev house. The diamonds sewn into their undergarments did not protect them. They only made the process longer. The contrast between what the Romanov family represented in terms of accumulated capital and what the 4 daughters represented in terms of individual agency over their own lives, is perhaps the most revealing fact in the entire story. On one side, the greatest fortune in modern history: palaces, jewels, yachts, thousands of acres of land, annual incomes in the tens of millions of rubles, an art collection that would be worth billions today. On the other, 4 young women who did not choose where to be born, who did not choose the father they had, who did not choose the sick brother who turned their childhood into an endless sequence of medical crises, who did not choose the war, who did not choose the revolution, who did not choose the Ipatiev house, who did not choose the basement, and who did not choose the diamond-lined corsets that made them die more slowly than they would have without them. That asymmetry between the wealth of the system they belonged to and the poverty of options that system left them is the true core of their story. And it is also the reason that story remains so deeply unsettling more than a century later. Nicholas II was canonized as the wealthiest man in history. His 4 daughters were canonized as saints. What they were not, at any moment of their short lives, was free. There is one final image that deserves space before closing this story. On July 17, 1998, 80 years to the day after the execution, a funeral cortege moved through the streets of St. Petersburg with the coffins of Nicholas II, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, and the 3rd identified sister, along with the 4 servants who died with them. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first post-Soviet president, delivered a speech in which he spoke of one of the most shameful crimes in Russian history and of the need to atone for that collective guilt. Prince Michael of Kent, the sister's 3rd cousin, represented Queen Elizabeth II. Romanov descendants arrived from across Europe and America. The coffins were laid to rest in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, where all Russian emperors have rested since Peter the Great. The remains of Alexei and the 4th sister, found in 2007 in the 2nd pit, 70 meters from the 1st, have still not received a definitive burial. They remain in Russian state archives, pending a resolution that the Orthodox Church continues to block for reasons that the scientists who conducted the DNA tests consider strictly political. 80 years after the Bolsheviks buried them in the forest, 2 of Nicholas and Alexandra's children still cannot be properly laid to rest. The Soviet state killed them, and the modern Russian state has still not decided what to do with what remains of them. The story of the Romanov sisters, as you can see, has not ended yet. There is also a dimension of the sisters' story that the obsession with Anastasia and with the survival of some Romanov has completely eclipsed for decades. The story of the other Romanovs, the extended family members who did manage to escape. Several of the Tsar's uncles and aunts, several cousins, several lateral branches of the imperial family, fled Russia during the years of the regime's collapse and settled in Western Europe, in America, in whatever country would take them. They carried with them whatever they had been able to take, mostly jewelry, transportable valuables, some assets in foreign bank accounts that the lawyers of the provisional government, and then of the Soviets, took years to block completely. Some of those assets generated litigation that lasted decades in Western European courts. Some were recovered, most were not. The Romanovs who survived lived lives of exile with the variable dignity that exile allows. Some adapted and built new lives. Others never overcame the loss of a world that no longer existed. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, the Tsar's younger sister, ended her days in Toronto, Canada, in 1960, 42 years after the deaths of her brother and her nieces. Working a small farm and selling watercolors she painted herself to supplement her income. The woman born to be a Grand Duchess of the world's richest empire died in Canada as an amateur artist. That fall from the top of history's wealth list to a farm in Ontario is the longest and most vertiginous arc that any story of destroyed fortune can describe. If this story has stayed with you, if at any point you found yourself thinking about what it means to be born or the end of something that doesn't know its ending, about what it costs to be the most visible asset of a fortune in free fall, or simply about who Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov actually were, beyond the white lace photographs and the formal gowns. Leave your thoughts in the comments. This story doesn't have a single possible reading, and we want to know yours. And if you want to know more about the great dynastic fortunes of the 20th century, and the women who inhabited them without controlling them, This channel has the story of the Kennedy sisters, of Babe Paley, of the Onassis heiresses, the empires built over centuries and destroyed in a single night. Subscribe. The next story is already on its way.